Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 664. I'm Tom Cagley, your host. The SPaMCAST 664 features our interview with Sunny Han, CEO and founder of Fulcrum. Sunny and I talked about motivation. We talked agile development. We talked about what it takes to see a vision through to reality. The ideas about engineering a communication architecture are phenomenal. Sunny Han is the CEO and founder of Fulcrum, a manufacturing ERP platform dedicated to helping manufacturers build a better future. He led Fulcrum to raise $3.1 million in a seed round of venture capital in 2020. Sunny is dedicated to delivering a connected future where frictionless manufacturing, production, and supply chains lead to faster and better product innovations. Sunny is quoted as saying, "There's no future of innovation that doesn't include innovation in manufacturing." Are you ready to see a vision through to reality? It's time for the interview. Sunny Han, founder and CEO at Fulcrum. Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
I am excited. This is cool. So, let's just dive directly into the deep end. Your company created an ERP system, and having been in the business for a while, I've implemented SAP, I've implemented PeopleSoft, Workday, all sorts of different kinds of ERP. Why did you build an ERP system?
Well, we had the same job for a while then, and in the middle portion of my career, I spent many years implementing very, very similar systems to that, and a lot of different ones as well. But I think that the biggest thing that is really glaring is that there are a lot of really cool things that other people are doing in other industries in tech that aren't available to manufacturers, to construction companies, to logistics companies, primarily because the underlying systems, the underlying ERP platform that they're using was never engineered with the internet in mind. So if you remember your days from SAP, there is no way to connect two companies together by SAP other than using some other middleware system or some EDI system or something like that. And it costs a lot of money. And my big hypothesis is that smaller, nimble companies that can't afford $20 million of Accenture billings to be able to implement SAP still are very important and will continue to be very important to the rest of the economy, and that a really well-engineered product can be just as good for the $1 billion Sarbanes-Oxley compliant company as it is for the $3 million manufacturer that's outside of Akron, Ohio. And it's actually better to start with the smaller companies, build it for the end user, and then scale it up to the really big companies than the opposite, because we've never seen the opposite really work.
How did you get there? I mean, is this something that you woke up one morning in a Marriott, Residence Inn and said, "Oh my God, I've got to do this. I'm going to be an entrepreneur. I'm going to write a code base. I'm going to get some people together." How did you get to jumping from consulting, implementing these kind of things, to taking that vision and making it real?
It might have been a Comfort Inn or like a Hampton Inn Suites or something like that. I wasn't a Marriott loyalist until after they merged with Starwood, but no, it wasn't really that. I mean, the honest truth is I tried a bunch of other things that were smaller. I really wanted to start a company. I really wanted to do something on my own. I really wanted to do something valuable and contribute, but I was too much of a coward to do anything big. And so it was a tool for helping people to forecast, or maybe an Excel tool that had some cool macros in it, or maybe it was a web app to, synchronize different pieces of data between companies, or it was a integration layer that was kind of like an on-premise version of Zapier, like very small tools. And really I just got incrementally and increasingly more frustrated with how little value it actually delivered, and how much effort it took to implement it, and how unscalable it was. And it was through many attempts at that my conclusion became, actually doing something really valuable requires a much bigger vision, a much larger scope, a much bigger footprint in the product that you're building. Now, you obviously can't build it all at the same time, But I think it took me a lot of failure to really achieve something great to realize I was dreaming and thinking too small. And everybody, I think, can go back in time and retroactively rewrite their story to say that they've always dreamed that big. But I think for me, maybe I'm the only one, but my biggest weakness in the past is I think I thought too small until I did the work and realized that it wasn't going to have the impact that I wanted to have if I didn't have really big ambition. So that I think was the biggest thing of incrementally trying things on nights and weekends, outside of work. And it was actually in this hot spring hotel in Japan on vacation that I was sitting in a hot tub looking out at this idyllic scene of trees covered in snow with monkeys in them, picking bugs out of each other. And I don't know what happened in that moment, but it was just oh wow, these hotels, all this infrastructure, all these buildings that I'm looking at, all these roads and trains, somebody took some risk to go build it. And you can't just sit around waiting for somebody else to build the thing that you want. You just have to try it yourself. And I quit my job 3 weeks after that. So there was some clicking point where I realized I couldn't also have a full-time job. I had to fully extricate myself from that. And it wasn't it could have very well been in a residence inn, but it was in kind of a moment of self-reflection.
When you made that jump, and obviously my audience is probably developer, tester, the normal sort of developer that probably is thinking about whether it's, let's start a side gig or what I'm doing isn't having the value. I want to make the big jump. When you made that jump and decided to quit your job, that's a significant risk. How did you justify that in your head?
I don't think I did. I wouldn't say that it was an incredibly responsible decision where I had everything metered out. I think I had a subconscious level of comfort. I'd saved some money. I didn't really do some math and say this is going to give me X number of months of runway or anything else that would be much more reasonable to do. But yeah, there wasn't this sense of where I'm absolutely going to make it. But that's kind of where the leap of faith came in. I think the conclusion is I don't think you can, at least not for me, for a person like me, someone who has an engineering background, who learned to sell through a company that was willing to train me. For me, it really had to be something where the risk was embedded in it and that I wanted to do it enough anyway. And I think that was good. I think that for the other things that I did, by the time it got hard, I wasn't invested really in it enough for me to really say, okay, I'm going to keep pushing, keep persevering. I think that's the biggest difference, right? The biggest difference is if you put yourself in a situation where you have to succeed or face grueling embarrassment and self humiliation isn't the right word, but just a sense of failure that's a little bit more public, a little bit more a larger dream that you can't achieve. I think in those moments where something goes wrong, or when you lose a customer, or when you lose an employee, you just have that little bit more fortitude to continue.
No, that's excellent advice. One of the things I wrote down is that perhaps it was the vision that you'd created that made you, or allowed you to make that leap of faith.
Yes, and I think those are intertwined with each other. As you make a decision, your mind becomes much more open, I think, at least in my experience. When you're trying to achieve an outcome that you can predict, you only look for things that you can predict in that moment. When you try to say that I'm just going to spend my full time and energy, I'm going to work every hour, think every minute in the shower that I have on this, then your brain starts thinking about things that you might not be confident about, and you start testing more things. So I think they're very much related. I think they're related in your vision gets bigger as you commit yourself to something, and you become more committed as your vision gets bigger. So I think they're self-reinforcing loops there.
As a newer, nimble organization, how do you stay in? You're serving a market that's probably well underserved at this point. So how do you stay ahead of what a construction firm or manufacturers might need next week, a month from now, a year from now, those sorts of things?
Yeah, I think a few things. One is making sure that I hired a bunch of people that were really smart, but didn't have direct experience with manufacturing, and to go through the painful effort of educating so that they were experts from a place of first principles, from the ground up, from new knowledge. So I think that's number one. And that is really difficult, right? It's difficult to excite somebody about something that they're not an expert in already, especially if they're more senior. Like, people like to stay in their lane, if you will. I think it's also really difficult to not talk from a position of, I know this from a previous life, so I'm going to message that as the truth and just tell people think this, like, to be able to question your own knowledge and where did that come from. So I think that's probably number one. I think number two is not wanting an outcome, and instead of that, wanting to figure out where more value could be delivered. So I think a lot of other software sold by value-added resellers or implemented by a consulting firm, much of that is sold to the owners of businesses. And the thought process and the product development roadmap, you can kind of reverse engineer and say, clearly they were trying to just build whatever owners wanted and whatever their problems were. And I think that if you take a step back and say, how do we make this business the best business they can be, and where are they now? A whole litany of other ideas and a different prioritization set comes about. And that's been a source of our success for sure, is having the discipline to do that. And then lastly, I think it's also just luck. It is underserved. It is a lot of technical decisions that led to product decisions that led to where these companies are now. And we're still not, completely built through the list of extremely obvious things yet. So part of it is luck that we're in a space where most of these companies are owned by private equity funds. They're not really putting a lot of money into research and development, and they're building on top of existing hierarchies because that's what makes sense financially for them. So not every startup is able to operate in an industry that looks like that, right? So
is that luck, or is that really part of the vision that you had?
well, they're both the same, right? I didn't choose manufacturing. I didn't grow up with some origin story, and I wish I had. I wish there was a cooler story, but my dad and my mom were not manufacturing owners. I wasn't a mechanical engineer. I liked building stuff with Legos, but that's as close as it gets. I liked video games and writing plugins for World of Warcraft. And when I was a little kid, I ported a bulletin board dial-up game from one system to another. And that was kind of my first, attempt at writing commercial code. And none of those experiences, I think, would lead you to believe that I would somehow discover something in manufacturing. It was just through a series of saying yes to random opportunities that came my way that didn't sound super appealing, but I wanted to change, and being open to those ideas that I stumbled upon a set of manufacturers and started working with them and networking in there and discovering the problem, and a set of mentors and and bosses that talked me into thinking for myself a little bit more. So I really don't think that there's any intentionality in the path that my life took. So I have to attribute that to luck.
Okay. But I also think there's a lot of what you described there that, while it might be, some of that might be luck, right place, right time, has probably everything to do with being a learner and a sponge. And that's less down to luck than it is down to you.
I hope that's true. I appreciate the sentiment. I hope that there's something about me that's there. I certainly want to be that person. And I certainly push myself to not be lazy and to spend as much time as possible soaking as much stuff in. But yeah, I hope I continue to be that person.
Well, as I said, a big chunk of my listeners are in the development world, whether it's software development or enhancements or fixing the 5,000 incidents that might come in a night once you do a bad implementation, those sorts of things. How does Fulcrum develop? What is, what's the approach that you take?
So we've experimented a lot in our development process, and there are some concepts that we incorporate that are very common. There are there's a Kanban board. We use a program called Clubhouse to manage things. But I think that the unique parts of who we are much more centered around fluid communication. So our implementation people, whether they're engineers or not, there's no, approval process. There's no hierarchy. If there's a problem, you report a bug. If you need someone's help to make sure a customer's, data is correct and that they haven't messed it up somehow, you get an engineer, you ping them, and that engineer responds, even if it interrupts their day. If there's something that needs to be done, we all get together and do it. So I think one thing that was a big risk, because I had never seen it work effectively before personally, was to really tie all these businesses or all these different business units within our company together and try to make it very cohesive. Because in most organizations, there's some sort of sprint planning and some sort of scrum master and some sort of product managers doing prioritization, and we're discussing all these things and writing tickets out and having somebody on bug duty and things like that. I think for us, we borrowed a concept from WhatsApp's engineering team to say we want as close to a zero bug backlog as possible. We think about our organization as a cybernetic brain where each human is a neuron all connecting with each other. So we want to make sure that heuristics can form within the organization as well. And I think those concepts have actually served us really well, and we'll continue to invest in making sure the organization feels and works like that. And I think that also making sure that people are individually responsible for things, having a single point of individual responsibility. Yes, we're all working on this feature together. You are the one responsible for it. Or yes, we are all working with customers and we're all fixing this bug, but you are the person in contact with the customer. You're responsible for testing it, for making sure it's documented correctly, for getting the customer to test it with you after you're done, and for understanding all the information there. So I think those are very subtle, don't seem very huge in terms of concepts, but I think those concepts are really, really, really valuable for us as a company.
I think, again, you're underselling what you've done. I mean, that's really solid stuff. That's things that I can point at least a dozen companies that I've talked to in the past couple of months that would just rip out their molars without Novocaine to get to. How did you get there? Is that just something that you brought with you? Is that something that was it the experimentation that you did? How does one evolve into that?
I think it's having an effect that you want more so than I don't even know how to describe it, more so than like a designed outcome. I think the engineer part of me wants to take the human architecture and say, all right, I'm going to have this subcomponent and it's going to work this way, and I'm going to have this subcomponent, it's going to work this way, and the communication architecture is going to work this way. The person inside my brain that wants to create the system is like I would a computer software program. I think I have to silence that and realize that the biggest part about any organization is human dignity. Like, we just came up with software recently in the span of human history, but we've always worked together as humans, right? Like, that is our secret as a species, is that we're able to work together. So for me, I really needed to have the discipline of thinking more about human psychology and even like tribal anthropology than software systems and development systems, because you want the best humans you can find in your organization. And humans are annoyingly and also beautifully variant from each other, right? Everybody's very different. And if you build it only for a very specific kind of person, you won't ever have any sort of diversity, and not just in gender or race or any other factor that diversity matters in, but more importantly in diversity of thought. So I think that was really important, and that's how I set out to design the communication architect. Because even if there's only 3 people in your company and you're a founder and a CEO, that is your job. And it continues to be your job as you scale up and become a 30-person company or a 500-person company. My job for the rest of my ability to continue to be that CEO is to continuously evolve and engineer this communication architecture. And to do that, I think I have to understand what are the types of humans that are going to bring a diverse set of thought to my company, and how do I make that work in as flexible a way as possible. So That I think was the framework that I built all these things in, and everything else was just pillaging other people's good ideas, was reading books and watching YouTube videos and talking to other founders and going on LinkedIn and looking at people that were at Series A or Series B or whatever fundraising event just ahead of us and asking them about all their painful lessons and pulling together some of the concepts that I thought resonated with that framework and experimenting by plugging them in and seeing what happened. And some of them were disastrous and some of them were really valuable and keeping the valuable ones going. So
super. When Fulcrum is 5,000 people or 10,000 people or 20,000 people, will this work?
I don't know. I certainly don't think it'll be instantiated in the same way that it exists right now, but I hope that some of the concepts that are important still exist. And for me, I think about cities, right? As we started having agriculture and we started having larger cities, I think the same feeling of connectedness still existed in those cities. They were just abstracted to different sub-organizations. And even now with the internet, we are connected with billions of people. I do think that connectivity still exists. They're just existing sometimes in person, but other times in a video game or other times, with a group of friends that are watching a movie together or chatting on Discord or whatever it may be. I think the same concept still exists. I think my challenge, if we're lucky enough to get to that size and scale, is to try to be thoughtful about how do I want to steer the ship to create these subcultures and sub-organizations, and how do they interact with each other? How do they maintain as much autonomy as possible? Because I think the heft and the weight of hierarchy as you get larger is really good for controlling a business and moving it forward in a reliable, repeatable way. But it's also the reason why we're able to be an upstart disruptor in our space and take over some market share. So if we want to continuously be as innovative and as forward-thinking as we are now, I think I'm going to have to work with a bunch of other people that I haven't even hired yet, haven't even met yet, to come up with the right plan for how do we scale in a very different way, right? Not scale up, but scale down all these concepts into smaller subgroups within the company. How do they form? How do we make that as organic and as autonomous as possible? And how do we make it work within this larger ecosystem? So I have some cursory thoughts about that. I think about that kind of randomly once in a while, but I think as we get bigger, those types of thoughts will become, much more central to how I'm thinking about the company.
One final question before we start to wrap. You used the term value early on, and in terms of what Fulcrum delivers to its customers, to its stakeholders, how do you define value?
If we think globally about what manufacturing means to human society, it's about taking material, adding energy to it to make it better. And we really talk a lot about that internally. It's this concept of there's a limited amount of energy we have access to, and there's a limited amount of materials that we have access to, and there's a cost to both of those things. So how do we map out the amount of energy that's added to a piece of material, and how do we minimize that? How do we map out the amount of materials that are added to a finished good, and how do we minimize that? And how do we scale that out in the interactions between companies, in the distribution and in shipping things overseas or between cities? And how do we minimize that within the organization, within the company, within the manufacturer? How do we make sure that we have as much value delivery as possible? Because if we kind of took away all the complexity that our society has, and it was just me and you making backhoes for farming, we would have some understanding of what the need was in the marketplace and what our capabilities were in that production process. And I think with all the complexity we have right now, we don't have a system right now where most manufacturers really understand how they roll up to the end consumer, how it's being used. And we don't really even know who we're competing against or who else is in the marketplace and where we fit in. And so from a macro scale, between companies, we really want to create this environment where it feels, again, like we're working together to build things. And within the company, we really want to create this experience where you have live data and live understanding. So I know what everybody else is working on, and it feels like a team effort within the organization as well. So those are our conclusions from our analysis looking at our product, our industry, as how do we take the amount of energy and material that we need to do useful things? How do we make the end product more useful? And how do we make the process less costly? That almost always leads to a really great delivery of value.
Sonny, if you woke up tomorrow morning, someone handed you your caffeinated beverage of choice and a magic wand and said you had 2 wishes that you could solve any 2 problems that affect how value is delivered, what would those 2 things be and why?
For me or for everyone?
Yes, pick one. It is up to you.
I think the first wish would be for everyone to immediately somehow get a magic translator, where the words that someone says are translated into a way where its underlying meaning meant the same thing to you. Because I think so often in software engineering, in product development for physical goods, and everything where there's a creative task, so much politic exists, not even intentionally, but unintentionally, just by misunderstanding and the fact that we're very egocentric as humans in general, and we think that what we think and what we say should immediately mean the same thing for the person that's listening, and we don't adjust listening, we don't adjust speaking, and we do the wrong thing, and no one understands why, because your intention was the same. So I think that would be some universal translator, even within the same language, so the meaning could be shared. I think that would be a wish that I would have. I think the second wish that I would have is I wish that there would be a way to predict, not even in the long term, but just in the short term, what the impact of micro decisions are. And I think that is the difference in the exact same job that 2 people are doing, whether they're writing code or punching a press brake to form a piece of metal, the same exact job, but when you're really junior and when you're really senior, the difference is the senior person has a much better way of predicting the outcome of their small, seemingly nonsensical or like non-important decisions, and that junior employee doesn't. So I think that if we could somehow do that, if we could somehow give a junior employee that same sense of short, really, really near-term clairvoyance, that would equal the playing field and much better extract value from every human that's trying to do something cool and do something great. So those would probably be my 2 wishes.
Those are extraordinary. If people wanted to find out more about Fulcrum, want to continue the conversation, how would they go about doing that?
Our website, fulcrumpro.com, is the best way. And I always encourage anybody who listens to any of these podcasts, you can always reach out to me, Sunny, like the weather, SUNNY at fulcrumpro.com. I rarely actually get people contacting me, but I always respond. So feel free to email me directly. And if you want to know more about our thoughts on manufacturing and how we work, there's a page that isn't indexed on Google. It's fulcrumpro.com/grow. It talks about our gratitude towards our investors and our people, and it also talks about our thought process as well. So those are probably the 3 best avenues.
Super. And at the end here, I open up the platform for you to promote anything you like. So at this point, the platform's open. Yeah, it's yours. 2 to 3 minutes. Promote anything you'd like.
My biggest wish right now is for people to take more risks in doing things. So the thing that I'd like to promote is reaching out to me, to anyone else, to encourage everybody to network a little bit differently, to take a chance at working at Fulcrum, at working at another company that's a startup, to take your skills and to take your experience, to take that near-term clairvoyance that you've built up as maybe a mid-level or senior person, and to lend that ambition and lend that energy to us or to another company that's struggling to find the best talent that's out there. I think here in Minnesota and all around the United States, at least in this moment, there are a lot of really well-funded big companies, well-capitalized with huge balance sheets, and they're able to offer a level of stability that's out there. But I'm hoping that somebody that's listening knows somebody or is somebody that wants to take a chance, that wants to do something cool, that wants to change the way that the world works in some way. And if that's you, I would encourage you to email me or email careers@fulcrumpro.com. And even if it's a job or an opportunity with another startup that you might not have a connection with, or you might not be a good fit here, our promise to you is that we'll think on who might be a good fit if you're not interested in manufacturing, if you're interested in another subject area, and we'll put you in contact with them as well. So please, if you know anybody, if you have anybody that you've thought of as being that type of a person that you want to introduce us to, we'd be happy to talk to them as well. We just want to meet the very best that's out there so we can build the very best team possible.
Thank you for spending your time educating me and educating the Software Process and Measurement Cast listeners. There was a phenomenal amount of philosophy, and good advice. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me, and appreciate the good questions.
In Reread Saturday news, this week we focus on Chapter 7 of Monotasking by Staffan Nöteberg. This chapter is titled Recharge Creative Thinking. This chapter is really about the self-care needed to be both effective and creative. There are a number of ideas in this chapter that, if you're not familiar with them, are frankly just really good ideas. Many of the ideas in this chapter I've been using for years, and some of the inferred issues I'm still working on. As my experiment for this week, I'd love to say I'm going to sleep more. What I will do is move my phone away from the bed so I can't get to it as easily after I lay down. I will also work on having an equal mix of sitting and standing. Next week, we will complete our reread of Monotasking, covering the afterword from the book and some closing notes from me. We'll also start the poll to pick the next book in the series. The entries for the weeks of August 28th and September 5th will feature reprints. I'm going backpacking and turning off all of my communication devices. I'm thinking withdrawal at that point. As we prepare for the next book, is there a book you think we should reread? If you have ideas, please let me know and I'll add them to the list of current possibilities. I'm thinking about Kirsten's Project to Product, Charles Duhigg's The Power of Habit. That got brought up in my mind this week when we did the reread of Chapter 7 of Monotasking. Tony Buzzone's The Mind Map book. Staffan noted that book in Chapter 7 also. Chris Voss's Never Split the Difference. Chris Voss's Never Split the Difference. Douglas Squirrel and Jeffrey Frederick's Agile Conversations. There's room for more in this poll. Remember, buy a copy of Monotasking, read along, and do that for any of the books in the Software Process and Measurement Cast Reread Saturday. Next week, we dive into one of the aspects of the attributes of teams. Teams don't live in a vacuum. Every team is an intersection of boundaries of all sorts of organizations. Organizations facilitate teams to a greater or lesser extent. In the workplace, the employer's organization will have the most significant impact on how teams form and perform, but it's not the totality. Other influences can affect the structure and performance of teams. We'll also have a visit from John M. Quigley, who will bring his Alpha and Omega of Product Development column to the podcast. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?